they are in order: Eamonn Sullivan from Maynooth University, Susanne Rogers from Social Justice Ireland, Kevin P. O'Kelly from TransFormWork 2 project coordinator, and finally Dr. Alan Eustace from Trinity College Dublin, which is a joint paper with Professor Michael Doherty from Maynooth University. So without further ado, I think we're going to go for about 12 minutes for each speaker in turn, and I think we'll do Q&A at the end. Hopefully we'll get some maybe cross-cutting themes that may emerge for everyone. So at this stage, I'm going to ask our first speaker, Eamonn, to go ahead. I think we're all aiming for about 12 minutes each. The floor is yours, Eamonn.
Yeah, is there someone taking time or whatever, just to maybe...
I'll give you a nod.
Let me know, yeah. Hey everybody, my name is Eamonn Sullivan. I'm a PhD in the Department of Sociology, Maynooth University. And I'm also a taxi driver. I've been a taxi driver since I was 22. I returned to education. I went to education because I didn't really have a formal education. I left school when I was a kid, but I went to Maynooth when I was 40, and I did a degree in criminology and politics. So my supervisors are Professor Afra Kerr and Dr. Ciara Bracken-Roach, and I'm an IRC scholar. For today's project, my agenda is I'm going to discuss my project. I'm going to discuss some of the prior work or the literature, my research design, my methodology, Susanne, and theoretical framework and some of my early findings. So yeah, my project is called Taxi Driving Surveillance and Resistance in the Age of AI and Surveillance Capitalism. So taxi industries have undergone like what we call platformization in the last 15 years. When we refer to platformization in the taxi industry, we're talking about how taxi drivers were traditionally, as everybody can remember, you walked out onto the street and you got a taxi, and some people phoned them, you phone a cab or whatever, cab companies. But platformization has been the move from that sort of analog version of taking a taxi to now most taxis, particularly in Ireland or particularly in the Republic of Ireland, they're called through an app. So drivers have shifted from being workers with very little oversight to digital laborers who are managed and surveilled by algorithms on their smartphones. So this is what's called algorithmic control or algorithmic management. And algorithmic management is pretty much how huge platforms like Uber and Deliveroo and Upwork and TaskRabbit, they manage millions of workers all around the world using one platform. And because obviously this type of work couldn't be done by people, it has to be done by an AI system. And the AI uses the data that it gathers on all of the workers to sort of efficiently allocate jobs and connect passengers or buyers and sellers of services. So the regulatory environment is really important. So basically what I'm arguing is that the regulatory environment that the platforms exist in really impacts how the workers experience algorithmic management and how the workers experience working as a driver or as a delivery rider or whatever. So in Ireland, we can see there's my research, sorry, hang on, I'll just jump forward here. Yeah, so my research is a comparative case study between London and Ireland. And I think when I discuss the regulatory environment, it's important. The point that I'm making is that in Ireland, like we don't have the Uber that we have. I'm not even sure if we have it up here in the north, but my research is looking at London. And in London and in New York and in all of these big cities around the world where we have Uber, Uber driving, what some of my research participants called like student drivers or, retiree drivers. They don't have, that doesn't happen in Ireland. We have really sort of strong regulatory controls, and all around the world, Uber, when they sort of emerged in 2012 or 2013, well, between 2010 and 2013, they came into new cities and they really tried to disrupt the regulatory environment. And there was always this question of, well, how come they weren't able to do that in Ireland? And the reason why they weren't able to do that was the regulatory environment. In 2013, we were emerging from a long period of contestation around the deregulation and re-regulation of the Irish taxi market. So when Uber arrived and they're like, oh, this is, their typical strategy was that the regulatory environment was a product of a sort of a different era. It was arcane was the language that they used, and they still use that in the discussions they have today. But our regulatory environment had just been written up. So the Taxi Driver Public Service Transport Act is 2013. So when they arrived, they really couldn't make that argument. So just to bounce back to some of the literature. So Maguire and Murphy, this was a project carried out in Maynooth. So they examined the effects of neoliberal policies in Ireland's taxi industry during deregulation in 2000 and 2013, and they sort of documented the period just before these companies arrived, or the platformization of the taxi industry. These paper 3 and 4 there are really important because White and Larson, that's the most recent paper that's sort of been published on the Irish taxi industry, and they make the point that basically Ireland's regulations, not only how they regulate who can be a driver, but also how they regulate the infrastructure. So in Ireland, taxis are allowed to use bus lanes. So that's a regulatory thing. Taxis are allowed to use bus lanes. And the regulator also sets the price. So Uber can't use its typical model where it will charge, the model that they used right up until the last couple of years was they'd surge pricing and all of that stuff. So they're not allowed to do that in Ireland. But White and Larson's point was that the infrastructural thing really made a difference because we did have hackneys in Ireland. Remember, you'd ring an old cab. But when they deregulated, like most of the drivers, they really made it easy for existing SPSV, like small public service vehicle drivers, they made it easy for them to become taxis. So it was as if all the private hire cars in London overnight were given permission to become black cabs. And that's what happened in Ireland. So they didn't have that in Ireland, but they did have like limo hire and stuff. And that never really took off as an Uber sort of service in Ireland, because if you're coming in to the airport and you want to get into Dublin City, taking a black cab might be a nice, comfortable ride, but you can't use the bus lanes. It's going to take you an hour and a half, whereas a taxi will take you 40 minutes. So this is why I think regulation is important, because the regulatory environment, by having that pre-existing regulatory environment, the Irish government prevented the Uberization of the taxi industry. So anyway, to get there, my research questions were this, right? So how does algorithmic surveillance impact workers? Does AI inhibit workers from collectively organizing? Do regulatory controls impact precarity among workers? And do workers develop strategies to circumvent algorithmic surveillance? So yeah, I'm doing a comparative study of London and Ireland, and I created a survey questionnaire that I distributed to like drivers on taxi driver forums in Ireland and around other places. I was trying to sort of get a purposive sample, and then I was going to draw in that sample to try and get some research participants. But actually, the long and short of it was it didn't really work. So my survey questionnaire doesn't really play a huge part in my overall project. The content analysis of digital taxi platforms is really important. I use a method called the digital walkthrough, which is really interesting, where basically we just get people to set up new apps and we follow them and we can learn things about what the political economy of the app and stuff. And my main sort of method was my semi-structured interviews with drivers in Ireland and in London. So we interviewed regular taxi drivers in Ireland and then Uber drivers in London. So my theory section is a little bit complicated. I was listening around today and I was thinking, who is going to want to know anything about what Karl Marx had to say about all of this? But so there's this sort of theory that he came up with, subsumption, where he talks about capital taking over production as it finds it. So if you think about in the taxi industry, Uber came along at a time and they didn't really change the taxi industry. They changed the middleman. So if you think of like old formal subsumption was like taxi companies, taxi rentals, and then when Uber and Free Now and Halo came along, they were kind of doing the same thing. They just replaced the cab companies. But real subsumption was when capital fundamentally alters the labor process. And if you think about what they call dynamic pricing now, where there's no relationship between like what the driver gets paid and what the customer pays. So Uber is using people's data. They're using, like, if Michael wants to take a taxi into the airport, well, Uber knows that Michael has a flight in an hour, so he's going to pay 60 quid for the taxi. But the driver, they have so many drivers that they know that he lives out beside the airport and he finishes at this time, so he'll go out for a tenner. So now Uber they're doing this arbitrage thing where they're taking everything in the middle, and the driver's getting paid little, and the passenger's being paid as much. They're squeezing as much out of the passenger. So that's what we call real, or at least that's what my argument is, that this is real subsumption. I was going to go into Foucault here, but I'll jump past Foucault. So these are some of the, sorry, just another thing that's important. So informal subsumption, the only way that capital, while it seizes sort of production as it finds it, the only way it can sort of increase its productivity is by making workers work harder. So, and I like these extracts. So this one was from one of my participants. I'm hyper focused on getting them jobs done. I wouldn't go home for my dinner or anything until I got the bonus. It keeps me motivated. So this is when the apps are sort of gamifying the workers. They're encouraging them to do extra shifts and stuff. So finding two drivers I just wanted to jump across here. I have a good few bits on the algorithmic management, but I'll jump across here. So taxi drivers in Ireland express a belief that collective action is necessary to curb the excesses of the platforms. So this quote here: if my dad knew I went to work while there was a taxi strike on, he would say that I'm a greedy little pox, his word. Because that was what he stood for. And when there was strikes, we done it together. We put our plates sideways, and that was a sign that you're on strike back in 2010. I seen them all working though, and it was Irish guys as well. Now, I've cut out a load of racist stuff there, but basically what he was saying was that we can't organize ourselves as drivers in opposition to these things because the other drivers will all undermine the strike. And then there's another one. Let's say we have a union and Jack is the head of the union. Jack comes out and says on the 24th of April, I'm not going to take app jobs between 7 and 11. And the driver's going to say, who the fuck does he think he is telling me I can't do this? And these are just sort of examples of drivers not believing in solidarity in the industry. I'm just going to quickly run through these. So the drivers that opt out of driving on platforms do so as a form of resistance. So these are just two quotes. Like I said, my main problem, first of all, it was the percentage. It is the commission. And I'm not stressed for a job. And like I said, I downloaded the app during COVID when there was no jobs. But now I ask myself, why would I give a percentage to someone when I can pick up a job at the airport and get 100% of the money? So it doesn't make sense to me. And then another quote: taxi drivers have become so dependent on them, the apps, that they've lost the ability to see that they can work independently. And then these are examples, and I've only sort of started analysing my London interviews, but these are quotes from the London drivers, and these are drivers that are subject to real subsumption. These are now drivers that are having to put up with this dynamic pricing that I've just described. So, and this is a quote: I'm not sure whether X told you or not, I just have anonymised the name there. In it, they tested it, him and another two people. Yeah, and all of them, three of them, different prices. So he's talking about how they had their apps open together, and Uber would send them all the same job, but at different prices. So it was using their data to offer them different rates for the jobs. I'm just going to read out this very last quote. So what Uber did here, they saw an opportunity. The drivers, when they're waiting in the queue, they won't take the work. In other words, they won't take the job that's being offered. So let's give it to him. And he's talking about another driver because he just arrived, dropped off. He's been doing that all the time. So then he goes to town. He's just giving an example here of drivers that are being encouraged to take jobs that the others won't take. So they're driving down the wages. So I just think that, I won't go into this, but I just think that it's an important example. Like what we're talking about here today, one of the themes was about good jobs versus crap jobs. And what Uber represents here, the Uberization of work, is the driving down of work. You know, if like taxi driving has always represented a sort of a means for people like me, like I have no education. Like, you know, I started driving a taxi when I was 20 when I passed the test. I was 22 when I started working, and they offered me sort of upward mobility. And what Uber is trying to do here, and what platformization of the taxi industry is, it's taking that upward mobility away, and it's making it so that drivers, like anybody that had got this opportunity for upward mobility, that upward mobility bit is gone. And it's also then, contrary to the program for government, it's driving down the fleet. Fleet standards are going down. And
okay, thank you very much, Eamonn. Okay, Susanne, over to you. Sure, yeah.
Previous life, I worked at a record shop for a very long time, so I could easily outshout the music as it was coming from next door, so that wouldn't have been a problem. And the only way I can keep to time is to literally write out every word I say and time it. So apologies, I will have the head down for most of this. Are we just going this way? Yeah, brilliant. Again, there may be a little bit of overlap between myself and Eamonn. I didn't read the memo before we turned up. Wasn't sure.
There's no overlap.
Huh?
I've been disappointed that there isn't.
Yeah, so fingers crossed. But again, just I suppose coming from a slightly different. Oh, this thing set to auto. Yeah, my name is Susanne Rogers, Research and Policy Analyst with Social Justice Ireland, which is a real organisation, and it has been around for quite some time. It's doing analysis, again, that sort of the greater good would be a little bit miscongeniality and world peace. That's really where we're headed for. So I will plough through this. Platform work, I mean, quite simply, you know, as Eamonn said, it's the matching of demand and supply of paid work to an online platform using an algorithm, which I will come back to. And it is an increasing aspect of the labour market. So we see it in jobs like ride sharing, delivery, dog walking, tutors, grinds, freelancing, and whatever field your chosen expertise is. And I was this is going ahead without me. Yeah. Oh, because it's keeping me. Oh, right. I usually don't put any. Can I change the display settings here? No, it happens. Okay, right. So I was reading Cyberboss by Craig Gent, which I would recommend everybody read if you're into this type of thing. And what he's saying is that we're not actually going to be replaced by robots. That's not what's going to happen. We see it in supermarkets that already the work of scanning, it hasn't actually been automated. It has simply been transferred from a paid employee to the customer. And we see that when you're buying a ticket, we see it with basic banking, we see it when you're shopping, that the work has now been transferred to the consumer. So it's a very different story than what we were being told. And the fact is, for most practical work now, human workers are simply cheaper and more reliable and easier to replace than the robots. And rather than being replaced by computers, again, what we're seeing is that more and more workers are being managed by computers by virtue of being subject to these algorithmic computational codes or rules that once executed convert data into decisions. And there's a quote here, I can't remember where I robbed it from. Knowing everything is a bit too much like knowing nothing. Without a story, it's all just information. So computers as the tool of the worker. Now we've got the worker is the tool of the computer. That's Phoebe Moore. And AI, it hasn't removed jobs, it's almost degraded them. So again, what we've got is this app that's penalising the workers who turn down work that's assigned to them. On an international level, then, the OECD has also found that in addition to a focus on upskilling and lifelong learning, reshaping social protection provisions must provide better coverage for workers in non-standard forms of employment. A greater focus on collective bargaining and social dialogue can complement government efforts to make the labour market more adaptable, secure and inclusive. So I'm not keeping up with this at all. So sorry, that was, yeah. There are about 500 digital labour platforms operating in the EU. They're very active in every EU country. The growth of the platform economy is illustrated by the fact that between 2016 and 2020, and again, if you think that's pre-COVID, before we all went online and before we all distanced ourselves by using machines, revenues in the platform economy grew by almost fivefold, from an estimated 3 billion to around 14 billion. And as I keep saying, I never thought I'd lose the run of myself and forget what millions and billions were. 1 million seconds is 11 days. 1 billion seconds is 31 years. So they're hugely, hugely different numbers. I just kind of have to remind myself of that on the regular. Yeah. Okay, Ingrid Robbins then. Sorry, no. This is getting very confusing. Apologies. One of the main issues, again, it's come up all the way through, is the employment status, access to rights and entitlements for platform workers, and the ownership and management of those algorithms and consumer protection within those. So the potential opportunities associated with platform work, such as labour market integration of disadvantaged groups and allowing women to remain connected to the labour market, have been referenced. However, it's really unclear how these potential opportunities are being or have been realised. We're not really seeing that. This is from Ingrid Robbins' Limitarianism. She also goes on to say that it might be a good way for a young person to earn a few extra quid while they're studying and living with their parents, but it doesn't provide the basis for an adult to raise a family in decent living conditions. In the meantime, the owners of these new platforms, as well as owners of companies with employees who have now been turned into flex workers, have become multimillionaires and billionaires. And if I can go back to, there's a book, As Gods Among Men, The History of the Rich in the West. Guido Alfani quotes from an Oxfam report. In September 2020, Jeff Bezos, then the richest man on earth, could have personally paid each of Amazon's 876,000 employees a one-off $105,000 bonus with the wealth he accumulated between March and August of 2020 alone, and still be as wealthy as he was at the beginning of the pandemic. So we're not seeing the wealth being redistributed, to go back to our friend Karl Marx, the way it should be. Algorithms in the workplace then, sorry. Again, what we're seeing is that management of people through that algorithmic system without any sort of oversight. So we do have regulations that are coming in. We're seeing things like the digital labour platforms are supposed to have these for human resource management, and that there should be certain rules put in place. I think Ireland has until 2026 to transpose the regulations. So personal data isn't, they're not able to process personal data on the emotional, psychological state of platform workers, private conversations, anything to do with your racial or ethnic minority. I'll run down through these. I think that the thing really here is about the black box. So even if you break open that black box and see what's in it, understanding what's behind those algorithms isn't actually going to make the job any better. So there's an argument to be, well, if we show you how we run these algorithms, then you'll be happy. And that isn't actually what's going to happen. A lot of platform workers, they said, they're engaging in all the unpaid labour. So precarious work, quite simply, it impacts on your ability to plan ahead. It impacts your ability to enter into contracts, retail agreements, as your wages are unstable. There's also extra risks to health and safety experienced by platform workers, social isolation, unconventional workplaces. We've all seen the lads booting through town on the e-bikes with a load of pizzas tied to their back. Like, it's dangerous stuff. And the algorithm then, as I said, is allocating tasks, it's monitoring and evaluating workers' performance and behaviour, and it undermines your autonomy, it undermines your job control, your flexibility, and ultimately it can result in heavier workloads, exhaustion, anxiety, stress, and negatively impacts on health and well-being. Okay, so we are at the lower skill tasks are more common in Ireland, with transport and delivery the most commonly reported for Ireland, with these workers engaged in this form of work on at least a monthly basis. And on location platform work was most commonly found in Ireland, which is where you had to go and do the thing in the place. So that's your taxi drivers and your deliveries and stuff like that. We really are concerned in Social Justice Ireland that it will exacerbate the challenge of precarious employment and the working poor problem that Ireland has, given the aforementioned regarding rights and entitlements, and the fact that this type of the income from this type of work is really low. Platform work, it erodes your collective bargaining efforts. It erodes, your ability to sort of to come together. And I know that there's talk of, app workers will, or they'll use like a WhatsApp privately, and they'll all say, right, none of us are going to log on at 7 o'clock. But then you're back to that problem that you have of, well, I need the money. Who are you to tell me not to log on? So there's all of that, but it's the employment rights at the moment, which are still really, really up in the air. So without the employment rights or the autonomy possessed by genuine freelancers or the self-employed, you're back to, again, the balance of power has swung. So we saw in the Industrial Revolution that the cost of unskilled labour was more than the cost of machines. And now what we're seeing is machines are now replacing skilled labour. And if anybody's done any kind of time and motion studies, you'll know that. I have a bit there on labour force. Ireland has a problem with Part-time employment and underemployment, I'll skip past that. In-work poverty is a big problem in Ireland, a remarkable statistic, again, at a country where we're at full employment. We're supposed to be on the pig's back or something akin to that. But again, you're seeing that even in that ESRI Pubble report from the other day, that areas of deprivation, they're seeing more and more employment, but it doesn't say what type of employment, it doesn't say what kind of quality jobs we have. We would see living wage as key to that. We would see social welfare supports as key to that. And there are policy recommendations. And I suppose just the unions isn't really part of what we do. But what you can see, I suppose, from unions is that they would traditionally have dealt with things like pensions, holidays, that type of thing. And they never really got into the specific technologies that were adapted by employers in pursuit of profits. So I think that's going to have to be a real gear change for the unions going forward. I've loads more there. Right, I will quit while I'm ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susanne.
Thank you.
Okay, so next up we have Kevin. You're okay, you're okay.
Thanks, Stephen. Right. Well, Kevin O'Kelly's my name, as you can see on the screen. I've sort of worked at the European level for quite a number of years. And for the last 12, 14 years, I've been involved in a group coordinating European projects that are funded by the European Commission. And I wanted to talk to you about this, which is a project that's ongoing at the moment. 5 years ago, almost exactly 5 years ago, the European Social Partners launched this document, the European Social Partners Framework Agreement on Digitalisation. And it was built around 4 pillars. And the Commission funded our group to have a look at how this document is being implemented in each of the member states, because the social partners in each member state were responsible for implementing the document. And it's built around 4 pillars. And one of them, the first one, actually, we had a discussion there immediately after lunch on skills, and in particular in this document on skills for digitalisation. And let's see if I can move this. How do I do it? Oh yeah, okay, great. But two of the pillars were around artificial intelligence and guaranteeing the human in control principle and respect for human dignity and surveillance. The third one actually was around connected, because it was a big topic 5 years ago, was the right to connect and disconnect when working from home after the pandemic. While we were doing that project, ChatGPT, isn't it? Yeah, yes. Was released. And suddenly the focus of the project we were doing, TransFormWork, came down onto the 2 final pillars, artificial intelligence and guaranteeing the human in control principle and respect for human dignity and surveillance, because the concerns about using digitalization for surveilling people at work. So the Commission came back to us and asked us, would we have a look at these 2 particular pillars in more detail? And so TransFormWork 2 is what we're working on at the moment. And the objective is to identify the impact of artificial intelligence and algorithmic management, which you were talking about, Brendan, and to identify appropriate innovations, strategies, mechanisms, and practices for the successful application of AI, and to ensure, because it's in this agreement, to ensure the human in control always in the use of artificial intelligence. So the project partners, the countries involved, the social partners in these countries, with one exception, Bulgaria, Cyprus, Ireland, Italy, Malta, and Romania. Poland, the Poland partners in it is the academic sort of organization that it's the one of the universities in Warsaw, and they have the academic focus. And we're focusing in this project on 5 business sectors, 2 of them in the public sector, education and health services, and then in the private sector, financial services, banks, building societies, that sort of thing. Industrial production, which is quite broad. So it's up to the partners to decide how to do that. And one that's very much in the news these days, sorry about the pun, is news media, and how artificial intelligence can interfere with news coverage. I'm not going to read that out, but since we started the project, the AI Act regulation has come into force, and now there's an official legal EU level definition of the Act. But the definition we were using, because we had a look at a lot of different definitions about what AI is, and we've simply looked at computer systems capable of performing complex tasks that only humans could do. So that's the focus that we have in this project. So some details on it. That's the Eurostat report on, in the blue lines are in 2024 is where the level that artificial intelligence is being used across the member states. Interesting enough, the 7 countries that are involved in our project, 2 of them are in the middle, Malta and Ireland, and 3 of them are 5 of them are in the last 6 countries. Hungary is not involved. And so there's a great divergence across the, as you can see, across the 27 member states, but also across the countries that are involved in our project. There's some of the figures. I'm not going to go into them. Very, very difficult to find the figures. So they're not comparative because they've come from different sources. In fact, for Romania, it's nearly impossible to find any figures on the application of artificial intelligence. But I put that up because one of the key things that has come out so far of our project, and that's a graphic there, you can see digitalization is quite strong, in particular in Ireland and Malta, but AI is still very much in its infancy in its application. So we finished the desk research so far, just recently, and we're doing the comparison of the government national policies, and that's all been more or less completed. But the initial findings from the national reports are, sorry, I'll come to that in a second, but the approach of the governments in setting out national policies for the application of artificial intelligence has been going on for the last 4 or 5 years. Bulgaria, Cyprus, and Poland set out their national policies in 2020. Ireland did it in 2021. Romania, just only a few months ago, published their policy because they've been very slow to get involved in this. Italy took a different approach altogether. They introduced legislation for the control of artificial intelligence and generally digitalization. Malta set out in 2018, they established a digital innovation authority, a state enterprise that's also responsible for digitalization, but also for artificial intelligence. And they eventually based on the work of this authority, published their policy paper in 2024, last year, and they've set up a rolling policy. So they're examining policies based on the work of the DIA month by month. And it's a very interesting, Malta is very interesting from the point of view they have absolutely focused on AI as driving their economy forward. And they're really very much into this particular project. In fact, we're having a meeting there at the end of September in Malta to look at what their approach to the introduction and the use of artificial intelligence. Two quick findings on this is that, as shown on the slide there, there's a significant gap has emerged in the application and the use of AI between the rich and poor member states. Between Luxembourg and Sweden, which are the two countries that are really big into the application and the use of artificial intelligence, compared to Romania and Bulgaria and Portugal. One of the problems with Bulgaria and Romania is the fact that over the last number of years they've had political instability. So there hasn't really been a drive from the government, from the authorities to deal with the challenges and the application of artificial intelligence. And the other thing that's emerged, the policy issue that's emerged, that even within member states, the difference between the use of artificial intelligence in large companies, medium-sized companies, and in particular SMEs, SMEs are basically in none of the member states getting involved in the app because of cost issues. A couple of minutes. Yeah.
Just under two.
Yeah. In Ireland, the use of AI, as I mentioned, the first policy document was in 2021. That's been updated now fairly recently. And there's been a number of other documents published by the government. The CSO estimates that about 94% of the Irish population use the internet daily. And they also say about 15% of enterprises, that's taking all enterprises in the country, are using some form of artificial intelligence technology. The other two issues, very quickly, Stephen, if I could, is the key role that the Data Protection Commission has in all of this, because all of these major technology companies are based in Ireland. The DPC have a big role in the policing and the regulation of these organizations. And just the last point I will make is that the social partners policies is quite interesting. Obviously, the partners in this project, the Irish partners are SIP2 and IBEC. And IBEC are very enthusiastic about it. Obviously, they're very keen on the whole and don't see any objections or any problems with the use of artificial intelligence in Irish companies, whereas the trade unions are much more skeptical, cautious about it, and want a lot more information. And that's something that we've been working on. Okay, I'm going to skip this and move on to the last slide. Tom MacDonald said to me a few weeks ago that Michael Taft and myself are two people that have spoken at all 13 labour market conferences. So I'm hoping next year I'll come back with the full report on the findings of this project once we've finished every aspect of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And we turn now to Alan. Oh, Michael, come on, Michael.
I'm not letting
I'd like to say that I have some,
Oh, super.
that I don't have.
Yeah. Great. Uh-huh.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. So my name is Alan Eustace from Trinity College, and this paper is co-authored with Michael Doherty, who as I say, I will be dragging him up to say something towards the end. So it is slightly different from the other papers that we've looked at so far on this panel. But where it links in is the fact that everybody so far in this panel and in other panels previously today has spoken about the need for regulation to keep pace with changes in technology and the economy. So this paper is about the process by which labour law in Ireland is changed. And it looks at some of the actors and institutions that are involved in doing that. So this is roughly speaking the structure that I'm going to follow. I won't go into detail on every point, but the context for the paper, I suppose, is that this is the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Law Reform Commission, and it in the process of looking at that, it became apparent that the Law Reform Commission hasn't really dealt with employment law or labour law to a great extent, and I'll talk about a little bit more about that in a moment. But it's also, this is also marking the establishment of the employment law review group, which Michael is involved in, and obviously marking the development of the action plan to implement the directive on adequate minimum wages. So there's a lot of discussion at the moment about reforming employment law and how that should be done. So I'm going to talk about, as I say, processes and institutions that happens through, rather than any specific example of reform or proposals for reform, as some other people have mentioned. To look at the sort of approach that we're taking on this is to think about labour law reform from the perspective of legitimacy. And it's important in this context to distinguish between legitimacy and justice. So I'm borrowing here from constitutional literature, particularly the work of Tom Hickey at DCU and others. So justice is probably easier for us to understand. The idea that we're evaluating the merits, the outcomes of a reform process. Is it a good or a bad idea? What the reform is actually proposing. But the problem is that we all disagree on whether those things are good or bad, right? And particularly, I think in the labour law context, you tend to have quite entrenched sides on a lot of these questions. The proposal is made, which either the trade unions or the employers will say this is just a bad idea. But the way to try to narrow that gap is to focus on the legitimacy of a reform proposal. And that means focusing on the process by which the decision is made, how a decision is made, and by whom the decision is made. Because if you can get those factors right, then you'll minimize the risk that there will be disagreement over the outcome, or that any disagreement over the outcome will undermine the ability for the proposal to actually take root, right? It'll help bolster the application of whatever the reform process you want to do. So, as I say, we want to think about all of these procedures in terms of how do they work and who is involved in the process. I want to just look at some very quick kind of historical examples of this. So this is these are extracts. I'm about to put up two extracts from the comments by Sean Lemass when he was Minister for Industry introducing what ultimately became the Industrial Relations Act 1946. And so this is the kind of first quote, and I think this is a fairly normal, standard thing that you would expect to be associated with a labour reform. This is a kind of European consensus on how labour law reform should be done. You know, government is reforming the law in some way, but it gets constructive help from trade unions and employers. But later in the speech, the minister went an awful lot further and said that actually the particular bill in question, what was it, ultimately the Industrial Relations Act 1946, wasn't really the work of the government at all. It was framed as the social partners wanted it to be framed, and he wanted the social partners to regard it as their reform. And I mean, that, to my mind, this is an unthinkable statement from a government minister in the Dáil introducing labour law reform now. But this was the process that was followed for the legislation, which was a foundational part of Irish industrial relations, and to a certain extent still is. Now, these are the processes that we have. So there's a sort of institutional ecosystem of actors that are involved in reforming Irish labour law. So obviously there's the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. You've got very well established kind of statutory bodies like the Labour Court, WRC, Low Pay Commission. I'll come back to that one. Then you have slightly looser, less formalised, maybe without a statutory basis, organisations and groups. I know I'm missing some from this ecosystem, some that I didn't even know about, but I'm sure that plenty of people here are familiar with the various iterations of these organisations and working groups. And then obviously you have third sector organisations, outside the formal policy making process, but clearly are involved in policy making through lobbying, producing policy reports, that sort of thing. One thing to note that I've put off to one side is the Law Reform Commission. And as I say, that's the context for this project. The Law Reform Commission was established in 1975. And to date, by my estimation, there's only been 3 occasions on which the Law Reform Commission has touched on employment law in its work. So in 1985, there was in a review of contract law, they discussed employment of minors. That's children, not people who go down mines. In 2008, again, talking about contract law, they're discussing in a very limited way, effectively a decision not to decide anything about employment law. And then in 2010, they started looking at alternative dispute resolution, some of which has spilt over into the employment law context. And you have mediation at the WRC and that sort of thing. So very, very limited extent, the Law Reform Commission has gone anywhere near employment law. What they are is a sort of passive observer of employment law reform, i.e. they keep updated, revised acts in the sphere of employment law. So I have a list of them, but I won't read them all out. There's lots of important pieces of labour legislation which have been reformed, and the Law Reform Commission has noted that in producing the revised reports or the revised versions of the acts, but they didn't have any role to play in actually drafting that reform or developing that reform. Which, to me, just seems a bit odd that there is a well-established and well-respected body that is responsible for driving legislative change in a variety of areas, but is not the body that is turned to when it comes to changing employment law. There are lots of other bodies that have established themselves in that space instead. And while it does seem a bit odd, I think ultimately it's probably a good thing because of the aspects of legitimacy that I mentioned earlier, the how and the who. The bodies that are mentioned here that have played a significant role in developing law reform in the labour law space, work on the basis of participation by social partners to a greater or lesser extent. So, most of those bodies feature some kind of tripartite structure or, other form of participation by representatives of workers and businesses. And the way they conduct their business is much more industrial relations like rather than legalistic. And the Law Reform Commission tends to be much more legalistic in its way of working. So I think on both of those metrics, these bodies tend to produce more legitimate proposals for labour law reform than the Law Reform Commission would, albeit that the Law Reform Commission has an extreme amount of legal expertise. So that's my sign to hand over to Michael, because we're going to talk about the future of Irish labour law reform, which he's in a very good position to speak to.
In 90 seconds, Chair.
You have 2 minutes. 120.
Okay, well, I'll take my time. So yeah, I should. I mean, Alan basically has done virtually all of the work in the paper, so I thought that least I could do was wear a green jacket to kind of support him. So literally pull on the green jacket. So where are we going? In less than a minute, I can tell you. So there's kind of two roads. We could go back down, if you like, to some extent, the route of strong social partner, including third sector organisations being involved in law reform. After the crash, in particular, the financial crash, there was a lot of talk about so that killed social partnership as a concept. But once the kind of worst of the financial crash was over, social dialogue kind of came back a little into vogue, particularly when Leo Varadkar was both minister and Taoiseach, and also you had the setting up of the LEAF and so on. So one way to link back to presentations earlier is a part of the action plan required under the Minimum Wage Directive could be about building social partner capacity, not just in collective bargaining and negotiating, but also in processes of law reform. That's a potential option. There's probably a little bit, legally is a little bit more fruitful ground for these kind of things, because again, Alan mentioned earlier, the Supreme Court in Ireland has kind of done a little bit of an about turn in recent years and has taken a pro-labour turn in the sense that it seems much more receptive to arguments about collective labour relations. Now, whether this would extend to strict legalistic law reform, I'm not sure. But that's one option. The other option, though, is that we go down the other route. So I should have said I'm the chair of the Employment Law Review Group, but just to re-emphasise, I'm here in a personal capacity. I'm not representing the group in any way. But the group has been set up. It's the newest mechanism of labour law reform, and it's a legal group. There are representatives from the social partners on it, but they're legal expert, the head of legal in SIPTU, the head of legal in IBEC, and the role of the group is the role of the representative nominees is definitely not to advocate. It's there to provide a legal perspective strictly from representing their bodies. So that's the other option. And the question is, first, is this inevitable? For all sorts of reasons to do with declining social partner capacity, particularly perhaps on the trade union side, the complexity of things like the AI Act and all of these things. Maybe really these are such complex issues, they should be left to legal experts. I don't know. And the question is that desirable? Where do we strike that balance? And this is where I would normally, Damien, put up my picture of Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant and say, labour, industrial relations versus the law, which one will triumph? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Alan and Michael. So we've about, yes, everyone please come and join me. Hopefully we have enough seats there.
Time not sorry.
Yep. And we have a roving mic for anyone who wants to ask a question.
Making this look harder than it needs.
Yes, we're all very tight. Yes, utilization. So any questions? Great.
I've one for, and I've remembered it for Eamonn Sullivan. So you said at the part that like Ireland or Republic of Ireland, we've kind of avoided Uberization in taxi sector, but I had the impression that all the taxis are using apps.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, when I'm talking about Uberization, I'm talking about informal, what they call ride sharing. Is that okay? Okay, so when I'm talking about Uberization, I'm talking about that informal, what the platforms like you call ride sharing. You know, there's not much sharing going on, right? Everybody's engaged in capitalist sort of transactions. So, but you know, we're talking about that informal arrangement where people just use their own car. That's not a taxi. That's not, the driver's not licensed or anything like that. And they can't do that in Ireland. And my question in my research was, why can't they do it? And it's a lot of it's got to do with the regulation.
Any further questions? Okay, Chico, yes, of course you can, yes.
I just want to ask Alan about the 1946 Act. That was specifically, of the quotes from Sean Lemass, that was specifically to do with the setting up of the Labour Court, the legislation setting up the Labour Court.
Yes.
So obviously it would have been, there was agreement between both sides as to how the Labour Court would work, and the representation on the Labour Court as well.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that, you know, part of that story is that it was envisaged that the mechanism that was being set up, the industrial relations mechanism, would be the primary way by which employment relations were regulated. It was not envisaged that there would be substantive legislation as there has been, you know, over the last 40 years or so. So that's obviously a very different legal climate since the 46 Act was adopted.
If I may, but the 46 Act, of course, doesn't only deal with the Labour Court. It deals with sectoral orders, joint labour committees, things that have become really legal, controversial issues. Yeah, but yeah, absolutely.
Another question is back there, yeah. That's the tip.
So thank you for a great panel and really interesting stuff. You kept us awake at this after eating cake all day. Across the panel, it'd be really interesting, like from each perspective, what was left on the table was what should happen next.
Yes.
And if you were to look into future scenarios, which we're not great at in Irish policy, is where to go from here based on the analytics you've presented. And I think each panel member may have something interesting to say about it that I'd be interested to hear. Thanks.
That's a good question. Obviously, in the context of what is actually a very fast-moving situation itself. So we'll work along. So we'll start with you, Susanne.
Luckily enough, Michael Taft has already asked me that question over a cup of tea, so I've had time to prepare. But it is that thing that the world of work is changing. AI is changing how we work. So is it a case of do you completely ban platform work? Probably not. Do you regulate it? Like, how do you regulate it? So I think that the EU directive that's coming in is going to at least put some sort of shape on the employment rights of platform workers. So at the moment, as you said, I just log on to an app of a Friday night because I want a few extra quid, and I can go out and I can work, but I don't have the protections of being properly self-employed. I don't have the protections of being employed. I'm just out and about earning a few quid. So I think there will have to be some sort of, that EU directive is going to put in place where now those platforms are going to have to prove that I don't work for them. So it'd be interesting to see how that works. But for us, like in Social Justice Ireland, it is down to living wage, but that's no good if you're only working 2 hours a week. So it'll have to be, proper contracts. And then again, a solid social welfare system would really need to be underpinning that. Because what we're seeing in Ireland is anybody who's involved in that platform work, it's not a nixer, it's not monetizing your hobby, it's not a few extra quid to go away for the weekend, it's your primary source of income. And it is low income work and it's precarious work. So I think there's going to have to be a lot of work done in that sort of protection of employment, and that really will have to be something for unions to do. But that's the challenge, is that again, I'm at home and I log on for 2 hours, and as you said, who the fuck are you to tell me that I can't go out now and work for 2 hours of a Friday night? So that is the real challenge in that space. Thank you.
Just to be clear, it wasn't me that said that. I didn't make it up. So there's two things. I think the technology is there. We don't actually need Uber and Free Now and Bolt and all of that. All Irish taxi drivers are sort of governed by the taxi regulator, and the taxi regulator has all of the data. And there's no, I think Barcelona, actually, I see you have a Barcelona sticker there, but I think Barcelona actually has their own app. The city has its own app, and the taxi services are integrated into the rest of the public transport app. So I think that's one thing. And the other thing, I think that should be the sort of utopian future for platform drivers or driving as taxi. And I think it works for everybody, including, program for government and their intentions around managing like extra cars on the road and stuff. And the other thing, and it ties into the plenary talk this afternoon, is around skills. And I think what we need to be doing is skilling up our regulators. There was no real talk of that earlier. Like, we need our regulators to have the skills to be able to sort of anticipate what's coming down the line and to be able to react to it in a way that I'm afraid that it's not happening fast enough. And we talk about, it's in one of the papers that was written for this NERI, they talk about 40% or 30% of all jobs potentially could be lost in the next 10 years to AI. Well, if that is really the case, I'm not sure it is, but if it is, we need regulators that are there to manage that.
Michael?
So there's a quote that's often attributed to various different people, that it's hard to make predictions, particularly about the future. So I'm going to leave it to Michael to make those, if that's all right.
Thanks. I mean, in terms of lower for, I think it's going to come back big time to, I think, the question I asked to Ger earlier, and indeed that was in his presentation, was about what the political. You can have the law, you can have all the law you want, right? I have an Italian colleague here. Italy has wonderful laws. I mean, they're pristine laws. They don't really work that well, and they're not often observed. I'm simplifying, but basically. So a lot of it comes down to political will. So, for example, in the transposition of the directive, you could go down a route where the state could go down a route where it really resources the social partners. It really puts emphasis on tripartite structures, etc., etc., etc. Or it could not, and it could say, well, over to the lawyers. There'll always be people down the forecourts who will, do whatever is required for a sizable fee, and we cut the social partners and other actors out of it. It's a political choice. Now, obviously, political choices aren't made in a vacuum, and it's up to people in this room and elsewhere to try and lobby for one outcome over the other. But I think that's my prediction is it's one or the other.
Kevin.
Yeah, it's a great question, but human technology has been with us for hundreds of years, and we're just entering another era of technology, except it's a bit more challenging. I think within the European Union, we will be able to control a lot of the applications of technology, and as was in the framework agreement, the social partners framework agreement, that the human is always in control. My worries about AI and the impact on life is what the Americans are going to do, what the Chinese are going to do, because they're outside our control. And that's, I think, the big global challenge, whereas the EU, I think, will be much more human focused rather than some of the other big players in the development of artificial intelligence. But I would be very worried about, on Tuesday night, I was at a meeting in the TASC annual event in the Royal, the RIA in Dublin. And Mark Little was talking there about it, who's, set himself up as a technology expert, and he's been working at it for quite a number of years. And to hear him talking about the global impact of artificial intelligence, not specifically the European Union impact, but the global impact, is quite concerning, quite worrying, because a lot of jobs will disappear. But, you know, and any jobs that are being created by artificial intelligence are high-skilled jobs, people who have you know, are well educated and able to deal with the application of artificial intelligence. But a lot of the jobs that would be lost and are being lost are low-skilled jobs.
Great, thank you very much. Time for one more question. If not, I'll just add a couple of reflections for the tape. Just very conscious, all four panelists have looked at this from a southern perspective, as perhaps the only northerner in the room. Just for the record, obviously, there are a number of different dynamics here, in the sense that Ireland's part of the European Union, so there's a big interface there with the EU AI Act, for various reasons, which I shan't go into, which are well known. Northern Ireland's not part of the European Union, so we are subject primarily to UK regulation at present, which is very piecemeal. We are partially, the EU Act partially applies to Northern Ireland. There is currently a proposal from the Commission that it fully applies to goods, but then that arises in terms of how you distinguish a good from a service in this particular area. So that's an evolving debate, which is probably going to become very controversial in a very quick order. So watch this space. I think, basically to sum up, probably the common themes that have come across all five of the panelists have been around the importance of trust and transparency in terms of what happens, the importance of good, clean, up-to-date regulation and qualified regulators in that regard, and the importance of ongoing dialogue between employers and employees, and the importance of focusing on the quality of employment, and that ultimately we retain a situation where humans remain in control ultimately of what actually happens, even if there are some intermediate agents who are taking decisions. So with that note, I want to thank all of our panelists, and thank all of you for staying for this final panel, and wish you a very pleasant evening. Thank you very much.